Okay, here's a quick walkthrough of assignment 10. As before, we're going to grab this from GitHub, so you should log into GitHub and go to this assignment. I want you to be using GitHub more because it's used a lot in industry, or at least GitHub-like software repositories are used a lot with the industry. So is this sort of checking out software and committing it. So, okay, once you're in GitHub, it should create this assignment for you. Here's your assignment link. We want to copy that out because we'll use that in a sec. Um, and then inside that, if I go to that assignment, here's the original code, and then later on you can come back here and check that your changes are made to this code. Okay, so now we go to Visual Studio, we go to Team, Manage Connections, and that'll bring up the Team Explorer window here, and go to the Manage Connections area. We're going to do a clone to copy the code from GitHub into our local computer. So here's where we paste the GitHub repository, and then we select a location for it. And then we hit clone. It'll copy all the files down to your local machine. This could take just a sec, and then it should show up here. It should be bold-faced as the one that's most recently been copied. Now to get it opened up, it's a two-step process. I click on this, double click on that, and it'll open it up here, and then I have to open up the solution, so I'll double click on the solution and it'll open it up in the Solution Explorer. And it just takes a sec for it to open it up, and then over here in the Solution Explorer tab it should appear. Okay, so here in the Solution Explorer tab I should see all my code here. So this is our original Trade Explorer example. If you remember, we had a form that created a trade processor and used some interfaces, and we did a trade storage where we loaded trade information up. We did a trade parser, a trade data provider, a trade parser, and a trade storage interface. So I have that three-part things. I've adapted it a little bit here to create a little bit of a Windows interface. So besides the currency trader and the ADO.NET, which is the database routine, there's this currency trader contracts, which is all the interfaces, and here's the GUI. We want to make sure the GUI, this is what we want to run with this form in it. I don't have something set up quite right, and so when it goes to GitHub, it's not remembering that this is the default project. So right click on Currency Trader GUI and say, let's see, no. Currency Trader GUI and set as startup project. So that should make it bold. So this one's bold. So then now when we run it, it should bring up this form. So if it doesn't bring up that form again, make sure you right click on the GUI project and make that the startup project. So when we run this, it brings up this little interface. So rather than doing this all at once, I have a couple different buttons here so we can see the different activities. I can read the trade. This reads it over the internet from this file. Takes a little bit, but not too long. And again, later on we'll talk about this, making this an asynchronous activity. And this reads in 100 trades to add a little bit of time. Then we parse those trades. It converts them all into trade objects. That sits up there. And finally, we can hit store trades, which should write these to the database. I'm going to move this over so we can kind of see if we can see the updates here. But this is going to take a while to create these 100 SQL statements and execute them all. And while that's running, I'm stuck. The interface is frozen. I can't click in any of these objects. Can't do anything. And this is what we want to fix. So right now this is run synchronously. So while it's updating the database, this is frozen. Because we just have one task, one thread of execution running, and that thread of execution is running the database code. When it's done, it'll return back here. Now it just returned back, so now I can click and do things here. But again, that delay is not acceptable, so we want to move this to an asynchronous activity. And we're going to use what is called an asynchronous decorator for that. So the book talks about that in this chapter. Asynchronous decorator is a type of decorator. Again, it a way to add features to an existing class without necessarily modifying that class. So it creates it talks about a general class here that hangs up the interface. And it implements this, it hangs up the GUI, the user interface. This class implements a method, and so we're going to change that. So what it does is they create an asynchronous component that implements the same interface and includes the component that was slowing everything down. And it used to run a process method, so it defines its own process method and calls this with this special task button, which creates a separate task, uses multitasking to create its own task and run this. You can almost think of it as in the background or in another thread here. So we're going to do something simpler. So let's look at a diagram to how this kind of works. So right now, we have our main class, our form here, and it creates an ADO.NET trade storage object and calls the persist method. This writes the data to the database. So here's our ADO.NET storage trade storage object, and it has a persist function. And we use this trade storage interface. So this plugs, sees that interface. And you can kind of imagine these as almost little plugs, like you can plug a phone into a certain cable and that cable into certain walls. And interfaces kind of define those. So we're using this. Now we're going to define this asynchronous trade storage, and that's going to include one of these objects, just like this. That's going to include it here. And it is going to call the persist method. It's going to implement this interface. And this interface, let's look at that interface. That interface only has the persist object in it. So the iTrade storage interface, it says that anything that does this trade storage just has to have a persist method defined in it. So it's going to define a persist method, and then it's going to then call the persist method here, and then we're going to be able to kind of map this so that the main class will use this asynchronous storage, and then the asynchronous storage method will basically use the ADO.NET. So we're going to stick this asynchronous storage in between here. And then that means over here, rather than creating an ADO.NET, we'll create an async trade storage object. An async trade storage object. It will create one of those. So that's what we're going to try to do, is set this up. So first we're going to create, let's go look at our assignment. So we've done this. We've loaded this all up from the local GitHub repository and have it all set up. We reviewed this. So we're going to add this asynchronous decorator to this class. So we can run that in a separate class. So to do this, we're going to create a new object that is going to implement this interface. So let's do that. Let's see. Let's put that. The original one, it was in this ADO.NET value project. That's the ADO.NET trade storage. Let's put the async one in the same spot. So we're going to go up there. We're going to do add a new class, and let's call this an async trade storage class. Okay, and let's look at the ADO.NET trade storage class, and that implements this iTrade storage interface. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to implement that iTrade storage interface. We're now using this namespace of currency trader ADO.NET. I don't have this quite set up so that when you create this new class, it puts the wrong default namespace. So make sure you switch that to the same interface, namespace as this. So we've got the namespace is currency trader .ado.net, and then we've got our class here, async trade storage, and it implements one of these trade storage objects. It implements that interface. So right away it's going to say that, well, we're not defining the function. well, first I guess we have to do an include here. So we're going to do that include. It'll stick that include up here. And then now it'll say we're not implementing the interface. So we'll implement that interface and it'll add this persist method here for us, because that's the same method that's over here. This does a persist method too. Okay, so now we need to also call a constructor. Let's see why. If we go into the GUI, the form for the GUI here, and I'm just going to click on one of these buttons to get to the code, and scroll up the form load code here. The form load code creates the different objects we want, including the trade processor. It creates a trade storage object, an ADO.NET trade storage. And that's what we want to switch to an async trade storage. And it passes a logger into this. ADO.NET logs information and passes the logger into that. If you remember here, this main object used to have one of these ADO.NET things, and now it needs to have one of these. So we need to create a constructor similar to the constructor here that for this. So let's go into ADO.NET storage and look at the constructor here. Here's the constructor. I'm just going to actually copy that constructor out, and it actually uses this logger, keeps track of that. I'm going to copy that out too, and then go to async trade storage and paste that all in and do some manipulation. So we're going to make sure this is a constructor, so it has to have the same name as our class, and we just pass in a logger, what method we're going to use to send log information out. And then we are going to we're passing that logger. We're going to keep it locally as a copy, so we're going to have that logger here and keep a local copy of it. So, okay, fix my typing mistake so that my constructor is the same name as the class, and so now that's all set up. So what are we going to do with this in the constructor besides we're going to store the logger? We also have to create another object. So this async I will create one of these ADO.NET trade storage. Again, the main class used to do that. Now we're going to have this class do that. So let's go look at the code there. So if you remember in our form, we declare a trade storage object and pass that on. So we're going to do that same sort of stuff here in async. Okay, we've got a logger here. We're going to also add another object, a async storage. So I'm just going to call this a sync trade storage object. And then down here I'm going to instantiate that. Once I have the logger, I'm going to instantiate that trade storage object. So I'm going to say sync trade storage equals new, and it's going to be one of these objects, one of these ADO dot. Now the constructor for that, if I look, needs this logger, so I'm going to have to pass the logger into the constructor for that. So that's why I have to wait to instantiate that until I have the logger ready to go. So now I have the logger here. Okay, I have to make sure I give this a type. So the author often uses a var here, which is a generic variable type. I don't like that. I'd rather declare something. So I could do a couple things. I could declare this as an ADO.NET trade object and do that. But we have this interface trade storage that they implement, and so I think I'll be using that instead. So here's, I think, how I'll declare that private trade storage object, and then I'll create my synchronous trade storage object. And down here I'll instantiate it, and when I do, I'll use the ADO.NET trade storage constructor to create that. Okay, so now I'm ready with a constructor here. Now I can go into my main form, find out where, here I'm creating this trade storage object, and I was creating ADO net trade storage. I'm going to create an async trade storage to do that. Let's figure out where my namespace is, what we're missing here. Somewhere I'm spelling these wrong. Oh, I'm putting an H in there. That's what we're doing. Okay, so now it's saying this object is inaccessible due to protection level, and I always forget, by default it creates private classes instead of public classes in C#, so I have to always add a public to the class name up there, and then that should work here. And again, now they're using this generic variable here. I really don't like the use of generic variables. They use them here. I would rather have them declare this of type I trade storage and have it declared through the interface there. The variable is okay. It's just I think this is a much more explicit and easier way to understand how that's set up. Okay, so we've got our async. We call the constructor here, and we create an ADO.NET trade storage, take the logger and pass it along, and we keep track of this. And now it's just the persist function. I'm just going to delete this and leave the persist method. Well, let's talk about what that has to do. So remember, what we're doing is the main class used to call persist over here. Now we put in this async trade storage. So the main class is going to call persist down here, and this persist should call this persist. So we've in ADO async, we've got to call this the synchronous version of persist. So how does that look over here? So in our persist, we've got this object that we created. We call it a synchronous trade storage, and we're going to call persist for that. And again, it's going to persist needs some trades to be passed to it. This persist is given trades. We're just going to pass those trades on here. So, and maybe we'll do a little logging just to show that this is going. We've got this logger. We might as well use it. So starting synchronous trade storage. So we'll log that before we go. Okay, so now this should work, but it's not going to do this asynchronously yet, but it's a good place to stop here and see how we're doing. So when I run this, again, I have to read the trades, I got to parse the trades, and then I can store the trades. And now this is still going to hang up. It will update the trades. It will do that, but it's just going to hang while doing it. We're not doing it in the background. Now, again, it's done. So that's a problem for us. So let's look at that in just a sec. Now, we've got to remember to be committing things at times here. So let's go over that real quick. This is a good breaking point, I think. So go into your Team Explorer. We're going to look at the changes. Again, we've made a bunch of changes here, and we want to commit those. So partially done with assignment. Still not asynchronous. Something like that. Okay, now remember these steps. We're going to commit it all. It's going to commit those changes. It says it was created locally. Sync to share your changes. I'm going to hit sync. Okay, that's goes to the synchronous stuff area, and then I have to. Here's my commit, and I have to push those up to the server. And again, now it'll push it up to GitHub. And it should be up at the GitHub. And I should be able to go up here. Remember when we had this window with the classroom stuff? I should be able to go up here and see things like in the ADO.NET. Now, here's my async trade storage class I've added. It's there. Okay, so make sure you do that submit sync, because that's and commit and sync and push, because that's how I'm going to look at GitHub. solution, make sure it's there. Okay, so let's look at the last thing we have to do. Is we need to run this in the background. So this decorator, in this example, they used a method called process. Our method is called persist. A little different, but again, we have to run this in the background in a separate task. So we're going to look at doing that. And in the assignment, I think I have hints here. Here's our method for doing that. So again, in our async storage, rather than running persist this way, we're going to run persist this way. We're going to create a new task, kind of have an empty object here to hold it, and then we're going to run, here's our synchronous storage object, and then we're going to call persist and pass trades to it. So basically, see this method? We put that right here and surrounded it by this task.run to run that method in its own task. So I don't need this anymore. I'll comment that out. Oops. I'll comment that out so you can see that it was there. And now I'm going to run this in the background. Okay, so I can save this and run this now. And now it'll be actually run in the background. So I can read the trades, parse the trades, and now if I hit store, right away, even though it's still writing the data in the background, it's still it's running it in a different task. So I have access to this interface here. Okay, so that's what we're working with in our database here. Now you might, so how do I know that the data is written in the database? It's kind of hard to tell. It says here, but actually it'll tell us right away that it is writing the database, and it doesn't actually show it right here. Depending on what windows you have up here, some of these windows will show that the data is being written to the database. I forget which one off the top of my head here, but we're not going to worry too much about that. But let's just stop this. And now this is how we want it. So we want to do a go back to our Team Explorer, go to Changes. Here's our new changes. Finished assignment. Commit those, sync those, and push those up. So let's finish this assignment. I'm going to go into a little more detail on something if you're interested, and that is one of the problems with the asynchronous decorator. This works fine with the fire and forget methods like this database, where we'll go out and do the database, but we don't need any information back from it. It would be nice to get a status update back from it, but we don't even get that. It is hard when you start another task to get information back from that task or to have that task update your GUI. For example, it would be nice if we could have the task update like the status box down here or something like that, but another task can't update this GUI, any of the GUI stuff here in this task. They're just limitations built into this. There is a method. You can create a task and give it a callback method, and that'll call back this. So let's just look. I'm going to do this read trades. When we run this read trades, it goes out to the internet, reads in all these trades, and that could actually take a while to read that information in from a website, depending on your speed and that sort of stuff. Let's say you're on a cell phone or something with a slow data connection. It could take quite a while to read in those trades. So let's put that to async. Now, in order to do that, we have to go out and then get the data back. And so I'm just going to quickly show you a solution there. Okay, so if you remember, when we read the trades here, we go out to the internet. Our form creates it used to have a URL trade data provider, and it passes the URL out there. And this would make a connection, open up a web client and connect and read line by line this trade data and add it to this collection of strings and pass that collection of strings back. Now we're going to do this asynchronously, so we've changed this to an asynchronous trade data provider here that implements the same interface. And we would like to do it as a decorator, but that just doesn't work very well. The problem is that we want to do this asynchronously and get data back. So we can create a web client and tell it to, now rather than just running this with the background, this is so common with web clients. They have special asynchronous stuff built into it. So with our web client, we can say, download this string asynchronously. And it'll go out and download this URL asynchronously. But we need that result, and we need to get that result back here. So one of the problems with this is that we can add a decorator or do this asynchronously, but to get the data back is difficult. To get the data back, we're going to add a callback routine in here, and that's going to call an use this object that the main class has created and pass it back here. So we got to get information back to the main class. So we say download this string asynchronously, and before we do that, we set up a method here that it will call. The asynchronous download will call when the download is all done. So this is what's called a callback method. So it'll go out, the task will go out asynchronously, download all the data, and then when it's done, it'll call this this method, and then this method's got to get the data back to the main program. So again, we've got to get the data back in here. So what we do is in the main form, we create a new object, a trade data updater here that can update some stuff. So we create one of those, and we pass that to our asynchronous updater. So this is given a we're given a trade data update method, and so once we have that, we can use that trade data updater to pass those lines back. So it just defines kind of a pathway back to our main program through this other object. So again, it gets more complicated when you don't use this fire and forget method. You can't just use a simple decorator method when if you're going to call a task and then have data come back from that task for that. So again, that was just too hard to do that inside an assignment. So I just wanted to explain it to you in case you're interested, but we don't have to do that as part of the assignment. So all you had to do for the assignment is set up the database to run asynchronously with this method. And again, you just have to commit your changes at GitHub, and I'll be able to see them there. Just submit a sentence saying that you're done. And if you have a strange GitHub name that I can't recognize, you might want to include that. Okay, good luck.